Avoidants don't fall in love easily, and before they allow themselves to develop genuine attachment, they put you through a series of tests, often unconscious tests, designed to assess whether you're safe to love, whether you'll become the kind of partner who suffocates them or controls them, whether you have the qualities that will allow them to maintain the autonomy they need while also being in relationship. These tests aren't typically calculated or malicious. They emerge from the avoidant's deep-seated fears about intimacy, from their need to ensure that getting close to you won't result in the kind of engulfment or loss of self they experienced or feared in their early attachment relationships. The tests function as the avoidant's way of determining whether you're someone they can trust with vulnerability, someone who won't punish their need for space, someone who has enough of your own life that you won't make them your entire world. Understanding these tests is crucial because how you respond to them determines whether the avoidant feels safe enough to fall in love with you or whether they maintain perpetual distance, keeping you at arm's length indefinitely. The irony is that many of the responses people instinctively have to these tests, pursuing when the avoidant withdraws, becoming more available when they are inconsistent, suppressing your needs to avoid seeming needy, are exactly the responses that make the avoidant less likely to fall in love because they confirm the avoidant's fears rather than alleviating them. Passing the avoidance tests requires counterintuitive responses that demonstrate you're secure enough in yourself that the avoidance patterns don't destabilize you, that you value yourself enough to maintain boundaries even when you care about them, that you're capable of loving them without losing yourself in the process. The withdrawal test, to see if you'll pursue or respect distance. The first and most fundamental test the avoidant administers before falling in love is the withdrawal test, where they create distance, emotional, physical, or both, and observe how you respond. This test isn't usually conscious or deliberate. It emerges naturally from the avoidant's discomfort when intimacy reaches a threshold that triggers their fear of engulfment. But regardless of whether it's intentional, the withdrawal serves a testing function. It reveals whether you're someone who will pursue them into their distance, violating the space they need and confirming their fear that closeness leads to loss of autonomy, or whether you're someone who can respect their need for distance without taking it personally, demonstrating that relationship with you won't require them to sacrifice their independence. The withdrawal test typically occurs after a period of closeness or vulnerability. You might have spent several consecutive days together, shared particularly intimate conversations, or reached a new level of emotional connection. The avoidant, feeling the discomfort of this increased intimacy, creates distance. They become less responsive to messages. They suggest they need to focus on work or other commitments. They become emotionally withdrawn, even if physically present. This withdrawal isn't about you having done anything wrong. It's about the avoidance nervous system responding to intimacy by creating protective space. But how you respond to this withdrawal is crucial to whether the avoidant will feel safe falling in love with you. If you pursue during the withdrawal, sending multiple messages when they don't respond, expressing hurt or confusion about their distance, trying to initiate more contact or closeness to bridge the gap they've created, you fail the test. Your pursuit confirms the avoidance fear that being in relationship means constantly managing someone else's anxiety about your availability, that closeness means losing the freedom to regulate your own need for space, that your partner will make their emotional state your responsibility. The avoidant interprets pursuit as neediness, as inability to respect boundaries, as evidence that you'll become suffocating if they get closer. Your pursuit during their withdrawal makes them less likely to fall in love because it validates their fear that intimacy equals loss of autonomy. If instead you respect the distance without pursuing, continuing with your own life when they pull back, not flooding them with contact, maintaining your own emotional stability regardless of their availability, you pass the test. Your respect for their space communicates that you're secure enough not to panic when they need distance, that you have your own life and don't need constant contact to feel okay. That relationship with you won't mean they're trapped in perpetual closeness without the freedom to regulate intimacy levels. This response makes the avoidant feel safer because it suggests you won't become the engulfing partner they fear, that they can have space without losing the relationship, that you're capable of the independence that makes them comfortable in partnership. The withdrawal test also assesses whether you take their distance personally or whether you understand it's about them rather than about you. If you respond to withdrawal with self-doubt, wondering what you did wrong, questioning whether they're losing interest, becoming anxious about your adequacy as a partner, the avoidant senses this, and it reinforces their fear that being close to you will mean managing your insecurities. But if you respond with understanding that their withdrawal is their pattern, their need for regulation, their process rather than evidence of your inadequacy, the avoidant feels less burdened by responsibility for your emotional state. They recognize you won't make their attachment patterns about you, won't require constant reassurance, won't need them to manage feelings that are yours to manage. The test also reveals whether you'll maintain your boundaries and standards during their withdrawal, or whether you'll accept any level of distance without consequence. If the avoidant withdraws and you simply accept it indefinitely, waiting for whenever they decide to re-engage without any communication about what you need, you fail the test in a different way. Your complete accommodation of their withdrawal without any boundary about what's acceptable suggests you'll tolerate any level of unavailability, which paradoxically makes the avoidant less likely to fall in love, because they don't respect partners who have no standards, who'll accept whatever they offer. The ideal response is respecting their space, while also maintaining that consistent communication and reasonable availability are requirements for continued relationship, demonstrating that you're neither pursuing desperately nor accepting dysfunction without limits. The withdrawal test is passed when you demonstrate that you can handle their need for distance without either pursuing anxiously or accepting their unavailability indefinitely, when you show that you have enough security and self-worth to maintain yourself during their withdrawal, while also having enough standards to require that withdrawal doesn't become permanent abandonment, when you prove that relationship with you offers both the space they need and the connection they secretly crave, without the suffocating demands they fear. This balance is difficult to strike, which is why many people fail the withdrawal test, and why avoidants often remain unable to fall in love. They're either with people who pursue too much, confirming their fears about intimacy, or with people who accept too much, failing to earn their respect. The person who passes the withdrawal test is rare, and their rarity is what makes the avoidant feel safe enough to consider falling in love. The emotional unavailability test to measure your neediness. The second test avoidants administer before falling in love is the emotional unavailability test, where they limit their emotional presence and vulnerability to assess how much emotional support and intimacy you require from them, whether you're capable of meeting your own emotional needs, and whether you'll demand more emotional engagement than they're capable of providing. This test manifests as the avoidant keeping conversations surface level, avoiding discussions of feelings, being present physically but absent emotionally, or responding to your emotional sharing with minimal reciprocation. The test isn't about the avoidant being cruel or withholding. It's about them determining whether you're someone whose emotional needs they can realistically meet without feeling overwhelmed or inadequate. The emotional unavailability test often involves the avoidant not reciprocating when you share vulnerably. You might open up about your feelings, your fears, your struggles, and the avoidant responds with minimal emotional engagement, maybe offering practical advice, rather than emotional support. Maybe changing the subject quickly. Maybe acknowledging what you said without matching your vulnerability with their own. This lack of reciprocation tests whether you need mutual emotional sharing to feel connected, whether you'll be satisfied with a partner who's present but not deeply emotionally available, whether you can be vulnerable without requiring them to be equally vulnerable in return. If you respond to their emotional unavailability by becoming more emotionally expressive, sharing more feelings, hoping to draw them out, expressing hurt about their lack of emotional engagement, pushing for deeper emotional conversations, you fail the test. Your increased emotional expression when they're unavailable signals to the avoidant that you're needy, that you require more emotional intimacy than they can provide, that being with you would mean constantly feeling inadequate about their inability to meet your emotional needs. The avoidant interprets your push for emotional connection as pressure, as demand, as evidence that relationship with you would require a level of emotional presence they're not capable of sustaining. If instead, you respond to their emotional unavailability by maintaining your own emotional stability without requiring them to provide emotional support, you can provide for yourself, processing your feelings through journaling, therapy, conversations with friends, or internal reflection rather than making the avoidant responsible for your emotional regulation. You pass the test. Your emotional self-sufficiency communicates that you won't make them responsible for managing feelings they don't know how to manage, that you can be in relationship without needing them to be your therapist or your emotional caretaker, that you have the resources to meet your own emotional needs, and you're choosing them as partner rather than as emotional support system. The emotional unavailability test also assesses whether you'll be satisfied with the level of emotional intimacy the avoidant can actually provide. If you need deep emotional sharing, constant discussion of feelings, mutual vulnerability as the primary currency of connection, the avoidant recognizes this and it prevents them from falling in love because they know they can't consistently provide that level of emotional engagement. But if you can find connection through other means, shared activities, intellectual conversation, physical affection, simple presence, without requiring constant emotional processing, the avoidant feels safer because it suggests relationship with you won't require them to be someone they're not. The test also involves the avoidant observing how you handle your emotions when they're not providing emotional support. If you become dysregulated, anxious, sad, angry, and it's clear that their emotional unavailability is destabilizing you, the avoidant sees this as evidence that you're not emotionally self-sufficient enough for them to feel safe falling in love. But if you maintain emotional stability, even when they're not providing emotional presence, if you can be happy and regulated independent of their emotional availability, it signals to the avoidant that you won't become a burden, that your emotional well-being doesn't depend on them showing up emotionally in ways that make them uncomfortable. The emotional unavailability test is passed when you demonstrate that you're capable of emotional intimacy. You can share vulnerably when it's appropriate, but you're not dependent on their reciprocation for your emotional well-being. When you show that you have emotional depth, but also emotional self-sufficiency, when you prove that you won't make their limitations with emotional availability a crisis, but rather will accept what they can offer while meeting other emotional needs through your own resources and other relationships. This combination of emotional capacity without emotional neediness is what makes the avoidant feel safe enough to fall in love, because it suggests they can have emotional connection at the pace they can manage without being overwhelmed by demands for more than they can give. The inconsistency test to gauge your tolerance for uncertainty. The third test avoidants administer before falling in love is the inconsistency test, where they vary their availability, reliability, and engagement unpredictably to assess whether you can tolerate uncertainty, whether you need predictability to feel secure, and whether their natural fluctuations in capacity for intimacy will create constant conflict, or whether you can roll with their inconsistency without becoming destabilized. This test manifests as the avoidant being very present one week and distant the next, making plans enthusiastically and then cancelling, being emotionally engaged one day and withdrawn the next, creating a pattern where you can never quite predict which version of them you'll encounter. The test reveals whether you're someone who needs consistency to feel secure in relationship, or whether you're secure enough in yourself that their inconsistency doesn't shake your foundation. The inconsistency test often involves the avoidance availability fluctuating without clear explanation. They might text you constantly for several days and then go days with minimal contact. They might suggest making plans and then be vague about following through. They might be warm and affectionate and then cool and distant. This inconsistency isn't necessarily intentional manipulation. It often reflects the avoidant's genuine internal fluctuations in their capacity for closeness. But it tests whether you're someone who can handle a relationship where availability isn't constant, where you can't always predict their engagement, where you need to be okay with not knowing where you stand at any given moment. If you respond to their inconsistency with anxiety, questioning what changed, asking why they've been distant, expressing that you need more predictability, becoming visibly destabilized by their fluctuations, you fail the test. Your anxiety about their inconsistency signals to the avoidant that relationship with you will require a level of consistency they're not confident they can maintain, that their natural fluctuations will create constant problems, that they'll always be falling short of your need for reliability. The avoidant interprets your need for consistency as pressure, as expectation they can't meet, as evidence that falling in love with you would mean constantly disappointing you with their inability to show up predictably. If instead, you respond to their inconsistency with equanimity, continuing with your life when they're less available, appreciating their presence when they're engaged without expecting it to continue indefinitely, maintaining your own stability, regardless of their fluctuations, you pass the test. Your tolerance for their inconsistency communicates that you're secure enough not to need perfect reliability, that you can handle the ambiguity of not always knowing where you stand, that their natural fluctuations won't create crisis or conflict. This response makes the avoidant feel safer because it suggests they can show up as they're actually capable of showing up, rather than having to perform a level of consistency they can't sustain. The inconsistency test also assesses whether you'll try to control their availability or whether you'll allow them to regulate their own engagement. If you respond to periods of distance by trying to nail them down to plans, by demanding explanations for why they've been less available, by attempting to create more structure and predictability, the avoidant experiences this as control, as inability to have autonomy over their own capacity and availability. But if you allow them to move toward and away as they need to without trying to control or manage their fluctuations, if you let them be responsible for their own patterns without taking responsibility for changing them, the avoidant feels respected in their autonomy rather than controlled. The test also reveals whether you'll interpret their inconsistency as lack of care, or whether you can separate their capacity for consistency from their feelings about you. If their inconsistency makes you question whether they care, whether you matter to them, whether the relationship is real, the avoidant senses this interpretation, and it makes them less likely to fall in love, because it means their limitations will constantly be interpreted as lack of feeling, rather than as difficulty with consistent expression of feeling. But if you can understand that their inconsistency is about their capacity rather than about their care for you, if you can trust that they care even when they're distant or unavailable, the avoidant feels understood in ways that make falling in love safer. The inconsistency test is passed when you demonstrate that you can find security within yourself rather than requiring external consistency to feel stable, when you show that you appreciate predictability but don't need it to feel okay in the relationship, when you prove that their fluctuations won't become the source of constant conflict or anxiety, but rather will be something you can accommodate without losing your own center. This capacity to tolerate uncertainty, to be secure despite inconsistency, to maintain yourself through their fluctuations is rare and valuable to the avoidant, and it's one of the key factors that makes them feel safe enough to fall in love, because it means they can be themselves, inconsistent, fluctuating, sometimes available and sometimes not, without constantly disappointing or destabilizing their partner. The independence test to determine if you have your own life. The fourth test avoidants administer before falling in love is the independence test, where they observe whether you have a full, engaging life independent of them, whether you maintain your own interests and relationships, regardless of the relationship status, and whether you're capable of being happy and fulfilled without making them the center of your existence. This test manifests as the avoidant watching how you spend time when you're not together, noticing whether you have plans and commitments that don't involve them, observing whether your happiness seems contingent on their presence or whether you're genuinely satisfied with your own life. The test assesses whether falling in love with you would mean being responsible for your happiness and entertainment, or whether you're self-sufficient enough that the relationship enhances an already full life rather than filling an empty one. The independence test often involves the avoidant creating space and observing what you do with it. When they're not available for days, or when they suggest not seeing each other for a week, they're watching whether you seem lost without them, whether you express that you don't know what to do with yourself, whether you become focused on when you'll see them again, rather than engaging fully with your own life. If you seem to be in holding pattern when they're not around, if your life appears to revolve around their availability, if you don't seem to have much going on independent of the relationship, you fail the test. This lack of independent life signals to the avoidant that falling in love with you would mean bearing responsibility for your fulfillment, that you'd become dependent on them for your happiness, that the relationship would become suffocating because you'd need them to be your primary source of engagement with life. If instead you respond to space and time apart by being genuinely engaged with your own life, mentioning plans with friends, discussing work projects you're excited about, sharing hobbies and interests you're pursuing, demonstrating that you have a rich life that continues whether they're present or not, you pass the test. Your independence communicates that you're choosing them as an addition to an already fulfilling life, rather than as a solution to an empty one. That falling in love with you won't mean losing themselves to your needs, because you don't need them to be your everything. The avoidant feels safer with someone who has their own life, because it means the relationship won't consume them, won't require constant presence, won't make them responsible for someone else's entire emotional and social world. The independence test also assesses whether you maintain your friendships and interests even as the relationship develops. If you start canceling plans with friends to see the avoidant more, if you abandon hobbies to make yourself more available, if your life gradually contracts around the relationship, the avoidant notices this, and it makes them less likely to fall in love. The contraction of your independent life signals that you're becoming dependent on the relationship for fulfillment, that you're making them your priority in ways that will create pressure for them to reciprocate that level of focus. But if you maintain your friendships, continue your hobbies, keep your independent life robust, even as you're developing feelings, it demonstrates that you understand how to be in relationship without losing yourself, which is exactly what the avoidant needs to see to feel safe falling in love. The test also involves the avoidant observing whether you seem complete on your own, or whether you seem to need partnership to feel whole. If you express that the relationship fills a void, that you've been waiting for someone like them, that you feel incomplete when you're not in relationship, the avoidant experiences this as pressure and neediness that makes falling in love feel dangerous. But if you convey that you're whole on your own, and the relationship is something you want rather than something you need, that you be fine single, but you're choosing partnership because it enhances an already good life, the avoidant feels less burdened by responsibility for completing you. Your wholeness, independent of them, makes falling in love safer because it means you won't lose yourself in the relationship and won't expect them to be responsible for making your life meaningful. The independence test also reveals whether you can be happy for extended periods without them, or whether you need regular contact and presence to maintain your satisfaction. If you seem unhappy or unfulfilled during periods when you're not seeing each other much, if you express missing them in ways that suggest their absence creates a void, if you can't seem to be content without regular interaction, you fail the test because it suggests you need more frequent presence than the avoidant is comfortable providing. But if you can be genuinely happy during times apart, if you can go periods without seeing them and maintain your satisfaction with life, if your happiness doesn't seem contingent on their consistent presence, you pass the test because it demonstrates you won't need more of them than they're capable of consistently providing. The independence test is passed when you demonstrate that you're a whole person with a full life who's choosing to include them rather than a person with gaps and emptiness who needs them to feel complete. When you show that you value independence and autonomy in ways that mirror their own values, when you prove that falling in love with you won't mean they're responsible for your happiness, but rather means they'll be joining someone who's already happy and fulfilled and wants to share that fullness rather than expecting them to create it. This independence is perhaps the quality avoidants value most highly in potential partners because it directly addresses their core fear about relationships. That intimacy means loss of self, that partnership requires sacrifice of autonomy, that falling in love means being consumed by someone else's needs. When you demonstrate robust independence, you prove that relationship with you won't require that sacrifice, and this proof is what makes the avoidant feel safe enough to fall in love. The boundary push test to see if you'll maintain self-respect. The fifth and perhaps most crucial test avoidants administer before falling in love is the boundary push test, where they behave in ways that test whether you'll maintain your self-respect and standards or whether you'll tolerate treatment that violates your needs in order to maintain the relationship. This test manifests as the avoidant canceling plans last minute, being vague about commitment or the relationship's status, keeping you at arm's length while maintaining other options, or behaving in ways that would be deal breakers for many people. The test isn't about the avoidant wanting to treat you poorly. It's about them unconsciously assessing whether you're someone with enough self-respect that they can actually respect you, or whether you're someone who'll accept anything, which paradoxically makes you less attractive to them, even as it makes you easier to keep at distance. The boundary push test often involves the avoidant behaving in ways that would typically warrant a boundary or consequence. They might cancel plans with little notice or poor explanation. They might be ambiguous about whether you're exclusive or what the relationship means. They might maintain contact with exes or keep their options open in ways that show they're not fully committed. They might be emotionally unavailable to a degree that most people would find unacceptable. These behaviors test whether you'll accept them without question, whether you'll accommodate them in hopes that acceptance will make the avoidant feel safer and more committed, or whether you'll establish boundaries that make clear such behavior isn't acceptable to you. If you respond to boundary violations by accepting them without consequence, tolerating cancelled plans, accepting ambiguity about the relationship, accommodating their need to keep options open, never establishing clear boundaries about what's acceptable and what's not, You fail the test in the avoidance eyes. Your acceptance of poor treatment signals that you don't value yourself, that you'll tolerate anything to keep the relationship, that you have no standards they need to rise to meet. Counterintuitively, this makes the avoidant less likely to fall in love with you, because avoidants don't respect partners who don't respect themselves, because your lack of boundaries makes them feel contempt rather than safety, because they need to know you're strong enough to leave if they treat you poorly, or else they'll never fully trust that you're with them for the right reasons, rather than from desperation or codependence. If instead you respond to boundary violations by establishing clear boundaries and following through with consequences, addressing cancelled plans calmly but clearly as unacceptable, requiring clarity about the relationship's status and exclusivity, establishing that certain behaviors don't work for you, and reducing your availability if those boundaries aren't respected, you pass the test. Your boundaries communicate that you value yourself enough not to accept poor treatment, that you have standards the avoidant will need to meet if they want continued access to you, that you're capable of walking away if the relationship doesn't meet your needs. This demonstration of self-respect, paradoxically, makes the avoidant more likely to fall in love, because they respect people who respect themselves, because they need to know you're strong enough that they can rely on you not to lose yourself in the relationship, because they're attracted to people who have the strength to leave if necessary. The boundary push test also assesses whether you'll try to control their behavior through emotional manipulation, or whether you'll simply state your needs and make decisions based on whether those needs are met. If you respond to their boundary violations with guilt tripping, emotional outbursts designed to make them feel bad, or ultimatums delivered from anger rather than from calm self-respect, you fail the test, because this kind of response confirms the avoidance fear that emotional closeness means being controlled through guilt and obligation. But if you respond by simply stating clearly what you need, giving them the choice to meet those needs or not, and making decisions about your own participation based on their choice, rather than trying to force their compliance, you pass the test, because this response respects their autonomy while also maintaining your own standards. The test also reveals whether you'll stay in the relationship regardless of how you're treated, or whether you'll actually follow through on boundaries you establish. Many people establish boundaries, but don't enforce them. They say certain behavior isn't acceptable, but then continue the relationship when that behavior persists. If you establish boundaries but don't follow through with consequences when they're violated, the avoidant learns that your boundaries are negotiable, that they don't actually have to change their behavior, that your self-respect is performative rather than genuine. But if you establish boundaries and actually follow through, reducing your availability when they're repeatedly unreliable, ending interactions when they're dismissive, genuinely walking away if they can't meet your basic requirements, you demonstrate that your boundaries are real, and this reality is what earns the avoidance respect and makes falling in love feel safer. The boundary push test also assesses whether you know the difference between accepting their attachment style and accepting mistreatment. The avoidant needs space and has difficulty with consistency. These are features of their attachment that a partner will need to accommodate to some degree. But there's a difference between accepting that they need more alone time than most people and accepting that they cancel plans constantly without consideration for your time. If you conflate the two, accepting all behavior as simply their attachment style, rather than distinguishing between what's reasonable accommodation of their patterns and what's unacceptable mistreatment, you fail the test, because it shows you don't have clear enough boundaries to protect yourself in relationship with them. But if you can make this distinction, accepting their need for space while still requiring basic respect, reliability within reason, and consideration for your needs, you pass the test, because it shows you can be with them without losing yourself. The boundary push test is passed when you demonstrate that you have enough self-respect to require respectful treatment, enough strength to walk away if basic standards aren't met, enough clarity to distinguish between reasonable accommodation and unacceptable mistreatment, and enough confidence to enforce boundaries through action rather than just words. This combination of strength and clarity is what makes the avoidant feel safe falling in love, because it means they can trust you to protect yourself, which ironically frees them from the burden of protecting you from their own patterns. When you demonstrate you won't tolerate poor treatment, the avoidant can relax, knowing that if they do hurt you, you'll leave rather than staying and resenting them. And this knowledge makes intimacy less frightening because the consequences of their patterns are clear rather than amorphous. The avoidant falls in love with people who pass this test because those people prove they're strong enough to be with someone whose attachment wounds create real challenges, secure enough that those challenges won't destroy them, and self-respecting enough that the avoidant can trust the relationship is genuine rather than born from neediness or inability to be alone.